talk about politics? Well, there are lots of different ways, but in the little dichotomy that I'm creating, there are two different ways to talk about politics. One is to talk about what really moves agendas in this country, and that's what happens in the back rooms. That happens with the twisted arms and the compromises and the negotiations and just the cold red meat of the political world. And that's kind of the politics that gets things done. I'm not going to be talking about that. Then there's political theater. That's what you see. That's the histrionics. That's the agony and the ecstasy and the comedy and the tragedy. That's the part of politics that I love, because at heart I'm still an English major. So I'm going to be talking about the politics that we see. And that's a lot of the people who aren't politicians, a lot of the news commentators, a lot of the radio talk show hosts, a lot of the people who were once politicians but aren't politicians anymore. And I want to talk a lot about the way that we use our own history, and especially our founding history, to frame a contemporary political discourse. And I want to start by talking about the current election, the election of 2012. And is this too loud still? I feel like I'm being too loud. Okay, this is okay. I want to make some predictions. We've got, what, a week and a half left before the election. I'm going to make some predictions in the election between, between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. And the first thing I'm going to predict is that the election is going to get nastier. I'm going to predict that they're going to call each other names, lots of names, and that their supporters, and that both of these gentlemen have supporters who honestly believe that if the other guy wins, America as we know it will cease to exist. And I am going to predict that they say this with increasing drama and increasing frequency and increasing histrionics, and that it's going to say Mitt Romney, oh, go, get back. Mitt Romney should definitely not be president, but neither should Barack Obama. Barack Obama, as a matter of fact, has ruined this country. And if he's elected again, this country will not survive. So who should you vote for? You should vote for Joe Biden. And he's going to publicly convince people to write in Joe Biden. And millions of people are going to do it, to the point where nobody's going to be sure if Joe Biden or Barack Obama is running for president, which, of course, is going to mean that the Romney-Ryan ticket is going to sail to victory. Just bear with me, it could happen. Now, after the election, I predict Paul Ryan is going to decide that really he should be the president. He's going to get it in his head that vice presidents can really quickly become president, and he's going to stage with the Electoral College, because you know the Electoral College is all that really matters. He's going to stage a coup and try to get people to vote for him instead of Mitt Romney. Now all the Republicans are going to know that Mitt Romney is their guy. Mitt Romney is their candidate, so they're going to vote for Romney. But all the Democrats are going to see a chance to stick it to Romney. They're going to support Ryan. Well, who are they going to call in? Bill Clinton, of course. Bear with me. Okay, I know I'm on a limb here. I'm on a limb, but this could happen. Bill Clinton is going to say, well, Romney is a disaster, but he's an honest disaster. This guy is a dishonest disaster, so you should vote for Romney. And Bill Clinton is going to make Mitt Romney the next president of the United States. And Paul Ryan is going to get so mad he's going to shoot him and kill him. And as soon as he kills him, he's going to come back on the very next day and preside at the impeachment of Sonia Sotomayor, who of course is going to be impeached because she lambasted Mitt Romney from the bench. How many of you think that's going to happen? Because that's what happened in 1800. More or less exactly what I just described was one of the, if not the most contentious presidential elections in American history, between John Adams, who had been serving one term, and Thomas Jefferson, who was his vice president. Now, things worked a little bit differently before the 12th Amendment. You voted for two people. Every elector voted for two people. It caused all kinds of problems. And it's in this election that these problems really came to the surface. So Adams and Jefferson are running against each other. And this is the first real party election. Adams was a Federalist. Jefferson was with this new faction, this new party that called themselves the Republicans. No relationship to the Republicans today, but that's just the name that they used. They later would become the Democratic Republicans, and then the Democrats, and then Lincoln would revive. Anyway, that's a long story. But Jefferson is running against Adams, and Jefferson and his supporters believe that Adams cannot win another term or America will cease to exist. Adams, they are absolutely sure, is a monarchist whose only design is to anoint his son, John Quincy, John II, or, alternatively, sell America back to George III in England. And they were convinced of this. The Federalists, on the other hand, believed that Jefferson was a Jacobin, which means a supporter of the French Revolution. And they felt that if he and his band of crazy weirdos won, there would be guillotines along the Potomac. Blood would flow in the streets. This was a high-stakes election. Both sides believed that the stakes were so high that if the other guy won, America would not survive. And this is very clear in the rhetoric of the day. Now, the Federalists, Adams was their candidate, but Alexander Hamilton was really the head of the Federalists. He was the power behind the throne. He was the kingmaker. He was so brash and unpopular that he could not run for president himself, but most of the electors, most of the people in Congress took him seriously, and he was furious with Adams. He considered Adams to be a fino, a Federalist in name only, somebody who had abandoned the major agenda of the Federalist Party in 1800, which was to go to war with France. And Adams had negotiated a peace with Napoleon and France, and he had kept us out of the war that the Federalists were just chomping at the bit to get into. So Hamilton decided who really ought to be president is Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Always used the Cotesworth to distinguish him from Charles Pinckney, his cousin, both of whom were from South Carolina, both of whom had been at the Constitutional Convention, signers of the Constitution. So Adams wrote a book. And at this time a book was a folio, but he wrote a long-bound essay about all of the things that Adams had done to ruin America. And at the end he said, vote for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who's running nominally as the vice. Again, things work differently. And he was so divisive within the Federalist Party that Jefferson and his young, hip, contemporary running mate, Aaron Burr, won the election. Except at this time, this was before the 12th Amendment, so people voted, every elector voted twice, which means that Jefferson and Burr, even though it was clearly understood by everybody that Jefferson was running for president, they ended up in a tie, and Burr refused to back down. So all of the Democrats in Congress backed Jefferson, but all of the Federalists, because they really, really hated Jefferson, they saw this as a way to black his eye, so all the Federalists supported Burr. And you ended up with a tie in the House of Representatives that was unbreakable until Alexander Hamilton came in and said that Jefferson is a knave, but he's an honest knave. Burr is a fool and a knave and a liar. And I would rather be governed by Jefferson, who's at least an honest idiot. And so he twisted enough arms to get Jefferson made president. And Aaron Burr, a few years later, as a direct result of this, and Hamilton frustrating him in becoming governor of New York, as the sitting vice president of the United States, Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel, shot him, and then came back and presided at the impeachment hearing of Samuel Chase, a Supreme Court justice who had denounced Jefferson from the bench, and Jefferson had arranged with the House of Representatives to impeach him. So that was the election of 1800. I often have been asked in the few speeches that I've given about this book, what do you think the Founding Fathers would say about the civility in political discourse today? And my answer is they would say there's entirely too much of it. It's been 200 years since a sitting vice president shot anybody. It's been 150 years since anybody was caned almost to death on the Senate floor. It's been 60 years since a president had to nationalize a state militia in order to enroll somebody at school against the wishes of the governor who was sitting outside the steps with a shotgun. I mean, we have actually pretty darn civil political discourse compared to what these people had. Yet, when we talk about the Founding Fathers, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were signers of the Declaration of Independence, as was Samuel Chase, Charles Cosworth Pickney and Alexander Hamilton, who were signers of the Constitution. When we talk about the framers or the founders, these are the people that we're talking about. And in our political discourse, and this has been going on for some time, but in our political discourse, we have come to the habit of talking about them as if they agreed with each other about things. We get statements like, the founders believed that the Union of States would have more power than the central government. The founders understood the multiple benefits of religion. They therefore aggressively promoted religion throughout American society. Or the other side of that one, the men responsible for building the foundation of the United States were men of the Enlightenment, not men of Christianity. They were deists who did not believe the Bible was true. Our founding fathers warned that the militia must never be replaced by a standing army. Is this true or false? Are these statements true or false? These are the things they fought about. This is what people were arguing about in 1800. These were the big issues. Whether or not America was a strong national government or a loosely federated collection of powerful state governments, there was not a clearer contrast between Jefferson and Hamilton than that. That's what they fought about. Whether or not America should have any sort of official Christianity or not, that's what the election of 1800 was about. Jefferson was routinely criticized as an atheist, and religion and what role religion should play in the body politic was one of the major issues. The standing army. There was a period of time when the Federalists, after the French Revolution really had a big impact on American politics. The Republicans were for their Republican brethren in France and wanted to go to war with England. And the Federalists wanted to go to war with France because they were pro-English, because England was our major trading partner. So and we didn't have an army. And we were all hot to go to war. We didn't have an army. We didn't even have money to pay an army. So whether or not we should have a standing army, Adams assembled a standing army against the possibility of going to war with France. He asked George Washington to be the commander of that. Washington accepted, but of course Washington was too old to actively command. So Washington accepted as long as Alexander Hamilton would be the actual general in charge. And that standing army was one of the biggest debates in the election of 1800. Did Adams even have the right to raise an army? Did America need a standing army? So what we get when we see statements like this, it's very easy to back up gazillions of statements like this with all kinds of quotes from the Founding Fathers, because this is what they were debating. But you got to be careful about quoting from one side of a debate and pretending that you're presenting a settled argument, because there are quotes all over on this, because these were the big issues, and many of the big issues today, taxes, federal power, standing army, religion in society, they're active issues today. They were active issues then. And the main assertion, if I could say that that's not what they meant, my book has one main assertion. It is that actually it's what some of them meant and what some of them didn't mean, and the gravest mistake we make in our political discourse, and this is made by both the left and the right, but the gravest mistake we make is presenting the opinions of our founding fathers or of the framers of the Constitution as if they were settled opinions that they all held, as if this were a hive mind where everybody agreed on important issues. They didn't agree on hardly any issues. And I want to talk about some of the ways that fact resonates. Okay. This is, I spoke twice this year at different Constitution Day celebrations, and I used this poster. This is a poster about Constitution Day, and I want you to look really carefully at this picture and tell me if you notice anything about it that might be, I don't know, wrong. Look carefully. Some of you know the answer, you can't talk. Here you have Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Here you have the Constitution. Here you have Ben Franklin, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. Anything wrong with that picture? Yeah, Kevin.
I think Jefferson was in France.
Yeah. Jefferson wasn't there. Jefferson was in France during the entire time that the Constitution was being created and debated. He had nothing to do with the writing of the Constitution, and as a matter of fact, wasn't even a big fan of it. He said a few positive things about it, a lot of negative things about it, but was not even particularly a supporter of the Constitution when James Madison sent him a copy. One of the things that I tell students when I'm teaching writing classes, which often turn into arguing or rhetoric classes, is rather than just looking at something like this and saying, boy, that's stupid, they got it wrong. You should look at the assumption beneath a poster like this. There are assumptions which make this logical. And I want you to hold that for a minute, and I want to look at two quotations from, actually we're going to skip that. We'll come back to that one. Sorry. Two quotations from this book by Glenn Beck. It's called Being George Washington. This book, I was almost done with my book when this book came out, and it really frustrated me because I had to buy it and read it and work it in a lot of places. But this is Glenn Beck's biography of George Washington. That's Washington right there, the blurry figure there in the back. Being George Washington, and it's a biography of George Washington as a leader. And for reasons that I do not pretend to know, Mr. Beck does not include any of the 8 years that Washington was actually president in his biography of leadership, but talks about his being a general, talks about him at the Constitutional Convention, and then skips right to his farewell speech. And at the end chapters, Beck tells us that there are 4 things we need to understand to interpret the Constitution correctly. And I want to share 2 of these with you. First principle, the Constitution recognizes the existence of natural law. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson referred to the laws of nature and nature's God. Natural law recognizes the existence of God and acknowledges that God established a natural order of things for this earth and the people of this earth. So we have an assertion and we have some evidence. The assertion is the Constitution recognizes natural law and the existence of God. The assertion is this is what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. Anything doesn't make sense there? Two different documents, if you want to say that something is in the Constitution, what's the best text to use to prove that? Anyone? That would be the Constitution. Okay, Jefferson, who was not there, may or may not have believed in a God like we conceive of a God, but it doesn't matter because he wasn't there. Then his 4th principle for interpreting the Constitution. The Constitution was created on the assumption that America would function under a free market economy, recognizing and protecting property rights. John Adams wrote, "All men are born free and independent and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of protecting property." Where was John Adams in 1787? John Adams was in England. He was our delegate, he was our representative to England the same way that Jefferson was our representative to France. John Adams had nothing to do with the creation of the Constitution. This comes from the Massachusetts Constitution, actually. So, how do we square this circle? How do we make these statements there is an assumption under which these assertions make perfect sense. And it's an assumption that I think is at the heart of much of our discourse, left and right, about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. And it's what I call the Founderstein Assumption. And that is the assumption that our Founding Fathers were a collective, ideologically coherent unit of people, any one of which can be substituted for any other of which to produce the Founding Fathers. So if you want to create what I call the Red State Founderstein, here's how you do it. You take Patrick Henry's fervent Christianity. Henry was a very committed Christian who believed that Christianity should be subsidized by the state. He did believe that, no doubt about it. Benjamin Franklin's practical wisdom, Thomas Jefferson's strong belief in limited government, George Washington's providential view of history. Washington really believed that God directed events so that America would become America. Alexander Hamilton's faith in the free markets. Hamilton, alone really among the founding fathers, really believed that free markets were capable of being an engine for economic prosperity. And then James Madison's belief that the Constitution had to be very strictly constructed. You could never deviate from the exact enumerated powers in the Constitution. But there's a blue state Founderstein too, and you can make them out of pieces of the same guys. Patrick Henry, strong Christian that he was probably the greatest enemy of the Constitution during the discussions and debates about ratifying the Constitution. He spoke against the Constitution fervently and led the opposition to it in Virginia and almost prevented it from being passed. Benjamin Franklin had a way with the ladies. Thomas Jefferson was a very committed deist. He was a Christian deist. He believed that Jesus Christ was a wonderful teacher, but not in any way divine. And he said that very clearly in a lot of his letters. George Washington owned slaves all of his life. Hamilton had this habit of shooting people. And James Madison went from being the strongest Federalist in America and a strong disbeliever in political parties. Madison hated political parties right up until the day before he started one. And his opinions over the course of his career were really all over the place. These are Foundersteins. And the trick is, I don't say Patrick Henry believed in state support of Christian religions. I say the founding fathers believed it. Here's a quote from Patrick Henry that proves it. Or I don't say that the founding fathers, I don't say that Thomas Jefferson was a deist who didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. I say the founding fathers were deists who didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. So what I've done is I've taken quotations and selections from individual founders and I've attributed them to the whole class. And in doing that, I can really make it look like I've got the founding fathers figured out. But what I've really done is asserted an individual opinion as if it were a collective opinion. And that's the mistake I want to talk about. Okay, let's go on to the proof text. I spent a lot of time in the second chapter of the book talking about the proof text. Anybody heard that term before? It's often a term used in biblical interpretation where you find a Bible verse and you find something from the book of John and something else from Deuteronomy and something else from Proverbs, and you string them all together and you say, this is what God believes. And you have no regard for context, no regard for the integrity of the works that these things are taken from. You just assume that the Bible is one document made up of 33,000 one-paragraph proof texts, and that any way you combine them gives you access to God's mind. And Christians have been doing this for a very long time. And we do this quite a bit with our own founding history. And it's even easier to do our founding history because the founding fathers wrote a lot. George Washington, the University of Virginia right now is publishing his correspondence. They've gotten to volume 67. They're estimating 90 volumes of correspondence. And he was probably the founding father who wrote the least. They didn't write email, they wrote letters. Gazillions of letters, and they wrote books and pamphlets and editorials and speeches. They wrote everything down. Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson. I mean, the works of these people would easily fill a library the size of this room. And you don't have to actually read this stuff to find proof texts. Where do you go for proof texts? You go to the internet, because other people have already found them. And it's really fun doing this because the same quotes just keep turning up, even ones that aren't true. Even quotes that aren't accurate keep turning up. I have this book, it's about this thick. It's called The God and Country Book of Founding Father Quotations. It's by a man named William Federer, and I think I paid $3 for it over at Bookaholic. And it's just one proof text after that. No context, no sensibility. If I want to prove that John Adams was an atheist, I don't have to read the collected works of John Adams. That would be hard. I can go to the Positive Atheism's big list of John Adams quotations. If I want to prove that he was a Christian, I can go to the, anybody know what the Wall Builders site is? This is the ministry of David Barton, who recently was a little bit famous. His book, The Jefferson Lies, was published by Thomas Nelson, which is the most prestigious Christian publisher in the country. And then other evangelical academics raised such a hue and cry over his less than honest citation styles that Thomas Nelson pulled the book. It is now being published by Glenn Beck and Glenn Beck's own media empire. But I read about 5 of David Barton's books, and what they are just long encyclopedias of proof texts. The Founding Fathers believed. Here are 75 quotations from different Founding Fathers, about 2/3 of whom didn't even support the Constitution. Let's use those to interpret the Constitution. This is how proof texting works. Let me give you 2 from John Adams, 2 really wonderful proof. I mean, these are darn good proof texts. If I were in a proof texting contest, I'd use both of these. John Adams, religion and virtue are the only foundations, not only of republicanism and all free government, but of social felicity under all governments and in all the combinations of human society. But John Adams also said, the United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. It will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods or were in any degree under the influence of heaven. Aren't those good? Can't you just argue back and forth? This is what John Adams believed. That's out of context. That's what he believed. No, that's out of context. That's what he believed. And we are cognitively predisposed to gravitate towards things we already think are true. This is called the confirmation bias. I bet Charles can tell us a lot about that. You know, so whoever reads these quotes, you show these quotes to 100 people, and most of them are going to say one of them is true and one of them is out of context. Well, it turns out they're both out of context. How do you know they're both out of context? Because there's no context. That's how you know that something is out of context. When you say, this is what John Adams said, you got to look at things. And the reasons why these quotes seem to be so different. Look at their genre. This is just basic textual analysis. This is what I do for a living, is textual analysis. So this was the easy part of writing the book. The first of these quotations comes from a private letter. The second comes from a book that Adams wrote. Do any of you write differently in email messages than you do in published works? Of course you do. One of these was written to one of Adams' best friends who was a devout Christian, Dr. Benjamin Rush. The other one was written, he was in England, he was really upset he had to miss the Constitutional Convention. So he wrote a book to be published in America giving his thoughts of the Constitution since he couldn't be there. One of them was written in 1786. One of them was written in 1811. Any of you changed your mind about anything in the last 35 years? Yeah. In his letter to Benjamin Rush, Adams had a purpose. He was trying to soften Rush up to say no. Rush had written him a letter saying, you should really make a statement. Now that it's 1811, you're not president anymore, you're at the end of your life, make a statement about how important God is. And Adams said something to the effect of, while religion and virtue are the only foundations of a republic, I don't want to do that. So this is that sort of wind-up where you agree with your friend before you let him down easily. In this one, Adams is talking about how important it is to be founded on God and not on priests. This was anti-clericalism, not anti-God. He was saying America, and if you read the whole passage, he's saying America was founded by God. God had a lot to do with this. God was really important. But we didn't have any priests intervening in between us and God. So when you look at these proof texts, and half of what I do in this book is just trace proof texts back to their sources. I tried not to make a lot of controversial statements in the book. I didn't make very many evaluative judgments of what people were saying. I just said, this is what they quoted, and this is what they originally said. I just tried to supply a little bit of context to the proof texts. And it has this amazing effect of not supporting most of the loudest voices in our political spectrum when you do that. So I want to go on. I want to talk a little bit about judicial philosophy and about the philosophy we use to interpret the Constitution, because there is a lot of discussion about this. How many of you have heard something to the effect of we should look at the original intent of the framers of the Constitution when we interpret the document? You heard that? And sometimes people call that originalism. That is not originalism. And I want to make a very sharp distinction between two different judicial philosophies here, two different interpretive philosophies, one of which I am very comfortable with, and one of which I think is a very dangerous fallacy. And that's the difference between intentionalism and originalism, or intentionalism and what we sometimes call textualism. Probably the nation's foremost originalist or intentionalist is David Barton, the author of The Jefferson Lies, the author of this book, which is about 700 pages long, called Original Intent. And he begins the book making a statement. It was, and typically still is, a fundamental maxim of law to determine the intent of the authors of a statute before attempting to apply it. That sounds like a reasonable statement, doesn't it? Do you buy it? What's wrong with it? Don't take my word for this. Justice Antonin Scalia, who intentionalists often cite as their guy, put in a book that I quite admire, put it like this: it is simply incompatible with democratic government, or indeed even with fair government, to have the meaning of a law determined by what the lawgiver meant rather than by what the lawgiver promulgated. That seems to me to be one step worse than the trick the Emperor Nero was said to engage in, posting edicts high up on the pillars so they could not be easily read. Government by unexpressed intent is similarly tyrannical. Now, Scalia draws, I think, an extraordinarily important distinction between the conservative but absolutely legitimate judicial philosophy of textualism, which is to look at the text, to look at the way that the words would have been understood by an average informed reader at the time, and to interpret the Constitution or the various amendments in light of what the text says, and intentionalism, which is kind of a historical telepathy by which you try to read the minds of the people who wrote this document by looking at things they wrote throughout their 75-year lives, and look at their diaries, look at their letters, look at their speeches, in order to come up with what they were really thinking. And there are two problems with that. Actually, there are three problems with that. The first problem is we can never know what they were really thinking. The second problem is, even if we knew what they were thinking, it wouldn't matter, because the people who ratified the Constitution did not have access to the framers' intent. Madison made sure of this. Madison did not allow his minutes from the Constitutional Convention to be published in his lifetime because he wanted people to look at the text. He did not believe that the intentions mattered. If any intention mattered, Madison said on the House floor, if any intention matters, it's the intention of the people, the citizens who ratified the Constitution and entered into the social contract. The opinions unexpressed of the people who wrote it were not voted on, were not ratified, are not a legitimate part of the social contract. And then we have even a third problem, which is actually a bigger problem than you might think, which is that there were 55 people at the Constitutional Convention, and all 55 of them had different original intentions. All 55 of them wanted to do something different. Only 39 of them signed the Constitution. The rest of them walked out at some point in the process refusing to sign. And even among the signatories, the Constitution is a compromise document. And compromise means nobody gets their original intention. Let me give you an example. It's one of my favorite stories from the Constitutional Convention, and it deals with what we call the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which is Article 6, Paragraph 2, it's what makes the federal Constitution trump state constitutions. And this was extremely important during the Civil Rights Movement. This is the part of the Constitution under which Eisenhower and Kennedy nationalized, federalized the militia, and required the states to integrate their schools, something we know about some here in Kansas. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Not one single delegate to the Constitutional Convention wanted this clause in the Constitution. This was an absolute compromise position between two different factions, one led by James Madison and one led by the non-nationalist, the ultra-states' right guy, Luther Martin, who ended up not signing the Constitution and becoming one of its opponents. Madison 4 times proposed something much stronger than the Supremacy Clause. He proposed a federal veto over all state laws. And Madison did not believe that this would be a secure country without that, because he thought that it was too dangerous. States had too much power to impose the will of a local majority on a minority. So 4 different times in the convention, Madison proposed the federal veto. The Southern delegates would hear nothing of this. They were not, because slavery, and slavery is the 8 million pound gorilla in the room that's never mentioned in the Constitution, but undercuts almost everything, is underneath almost everything they wrote. So the Southern delegates will not have the federal government vetoing state laws. Absolutely. So this is defeated by wide margins every time that it's brought up, but Madison won't shut up about it. So after the 4th time that Madison brings it up and it's defeated, Luther Martin proposed as a compromise the Supremacy Clause. And all of the other delegates voted for it. It was passed neminem contradicere, without comment. It's just in the notes of the convention, it just NC, which means that Martin proposed it, nobody objected, so it went in the Constitution. Now, Martin later admitted that he was pulling a fast one, that he did not include state constitutions in the clause, and he was a very clever lawyer. He was actually the lawyer for Samuel Chase. Remember, we talked about him getting impeached. But it was Martin's intent that would go in as written, and that then state constitutions would supersede the federal Constitution. The Committee on Detail closed that loophole after Martin had already left, and specifically said that the Constitution would trump state constitutions. But this raises a very interesting question when we look at original intent. What is the original intent of the Supremacy Clause? We can look at the document and see what it says, but nobody actually wanted this. Some people wanted something else, and some people wanted to shut Madison up and just get on with the business of the convention. So when we look for the framers' intent, we got to ask ourselves, which framer, which founder, what did they say? And it turns out that it's absolutely impossible to get any one framer's intent. It's even impossibler to get a collective framer's intent, and that leaves us with a textual standpoint. And that's why Justice Scalia, probably the most conservative sitting member of the Supreme Court, and absolutely a supporter of looking at the text of the Constitution, has nothing good to say about intentionalism. And on the few times where people have accused him of intentionalism, he has responded as angrily as I've ever seen a Supreme Court justice respond. Because he absolutely, originalism or textualism, this is a legitimate conservative judicial doctrine that actual judges hold. Intentionalism is simply a right-wing radio judicial doctrine. You do not see that in the judicial world. You see that on Rush Limbaugh, or Mark Levin, or Glenn Beck. So be careful. Make that distinction. When we talk about the framer's intent, we can talk about a generalized, textualized intent. But be wary of that kind of historical mind reading, which leads to things like this. I did this yesterday. It took me about 10 minutes. I just looked for I just typed into Google, what would the founders say about Common Core, elections, what would the founding fathers think of Facebook, the debt ceiling, gun violence, corporations, Barack Obama, the Ground Zero Mosque, Obamacare. What would the founding fathers think of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, This has become an obsession in our discourse, left, right, and center. These are 5 books that I used all of them when I was writing. That's not what they meant. And books like What Would the Founders Say? What Would the Founders Do? That's a pretty right-wing book. That's a pretty left-wing book. I mean, it comes from both sides. What would they say? What would the Founding Fathers think? What would our Founding Fathers say? You're sensing a theme here. And that is that we have an underlying assumption in much of our public discourse that if we could access the Founding Fathers' opinions, then we would know exactly what to do. We wouldn't have to think about things. And I'm not going to do that. I have an answer to this question. And this is the answer that I give. And in question and answer, we're going to try to leave some time for questions here. If you ask me the question, what would the Founding Fathers say about, unless you fill in that blank with the 13 colonies being governed by the British, there's only one answer that I'm going to give you. And that is, there you go. Use the process we gave you and figure it out for yourselves. Because the Constitution is an amazing process. It defines a way of debate and discussion and disagreement that allows us to confront very difficult issues, disagree, debate, negotiate, and come to very painful compromises. This is how we got the Constitution. This is how we work under the Constitution. So to try to govern by this sort of historical telepathy, what would the founders have thought about Iran getting a nuclear bomb? And you can prove, I suppose, anything you want about what the founders would have thought. Ask the question, how would the founders have suggested that we use the process they gave us to figure it out for ourselves? There are 2 views of the Constitution that they're kind of running through my presentation here, and I'm just about to end. 2 different views of the Constitution, and the one that I favor, I made purple because purple is red and blue put together. So this is where I hope we end up, and where my book hopes that we end up. To not see the Constitution as a noun, the Constitution is actually a verb. It is the document that constitutes us as a people. And I am in debt to Judge Richard Posner for that distinction in an excellent article where he talks about the Constitution being a verb. The Constitution constitutes us. It brings us together. It's not a Hammurabi's code that gives us the checklist of things that we should and should not believe. Rather than seeing the Constitution as a product of consensus, where these wise men met in Philadelphia and received wisdom from on high and came to a consensus, it's a compromise. And a compromise is a very different thing than a consensus. Compromise means I start here, you start here, we argue ferociously, but we realize that we cannot take another step forward until we can get together and we go through the hard process of coming to a compromise. And that the Constitution is one of the world's greatest engines of compromise, because it's very easy under the terms of the Constitution to keep anything from happening. There are all sorts of places in our political process where we can gum up the works. That, in my opinion, that is our founding fathers whispering to us through the ages and saying, compromise, you dimwits. Work with each other the way we did. I don't see the Constitution as a document that represents the best efforts of the greatest minds in history. I see it as a document that represents the best that some very remarkable people were able to do by compromising with each other. And finally, I do not see the Constitution as Hammurabi's Code or the Law of Moses or as a list of commandments or a list of approved political positions. I see it very much as a document that creates a process and does so in, I think, extraordinary terms that gives us the framework for debate, discussion, and compromise that ultimately allows us to solve our own problems by applying that process rather than by asking the, in my opinion, somewhat ridiculous questions that took me 10 minutes to find in a Google search. So that is my presentation. I